In this very in-depth forecast, two main regions for storm development are currently being monitored, where in the north, across Kansas and Oklahoma, widespread marginal severe thunderstorms could produce the potential for isolated large hail upwards of 1 inch. Further to the south in western Texas, a supercell or two could produce the potential for a weak tornado, massive hailstones upwards of 2.5 inches, and damaging wind gusts upwards of 70 miles per hour. Everything you need to know on Project Gladiator. Hello everyone, welcome back to another Project Gladiator weather forecast. Today I'll be covering the weather for April 24th of 2024. For today, we do have a slight risk for western Texas there, with a marginal risk that extends up across Oklahoma and Kansas here. We do have two main regions that we will be covering in today's forecast. I will likely be covering the slight risk further down to the south more than I do up to the north. But as far as the risks for today, we do have a 2% tornado risk for the slight risk region, a 15% damaging wind risk where we could see the potential for some scattered damaging wind gusts upwards of 70 miles per hour in the slight risk region. And then as for our hail risk, we do have a 15% with the hashed area, indicating that we could see the potential of some massive hailstones upwards of 2.5 inches in that slight risk area. And then we also do have a 5% that does extend up across the rest of the marginal risk, and that is going to be the primary risk the further up you go into Oklahoma and Kansas. The hail risk for the potential of some isolated large hail is going to be the primary risk. For tomorrow, we do have an enhanced risk for a lot of the central plains there, across the high plains into the central plains, across western Kansas, western Oklahoma, and northwestern Texas there. Risks for tomorrow do include a 10% tornado risk, including the possibility of strong tornadoes. NWS Wichita did have some very scary wording in their forecast that indicated strong to potentially violent tornadoes. Depending on what models indicate tomorrow and what models are indicating now, I do think a moderate risk for tornadoes is definitely not out of the question for tomorrow, but it does depend on what models are going to say. For our damaging wind risk, we do have a 15% where we could see the potential of some scattered damaging wind gusts, as well as a 30% hail risk where we could see the potential of some massive hailstones for that hashed area. Then for our day 3 outlook, we do have a slight risk across a lot of the central plains and Midwest for Iowa, western or eastern Nebraska, eastern Kansas, eastern Oklahoma, and northeastern Texas, as well as Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, and Iowa. Probabilistic, we do have a 15% with the hashed area where we could see the potential of some significant severe thunderstorms. And then for day 4 to day 8 outlook, for our day 4 outlook, we do have a 30% for the central plains for southern Kansas into central Oklahoma and northern Texas, with a 30% that extends up all the way into Wisconsin and into the upper peninsula of Michigan. So we have a very large area that we are watching for the potential of severe thunderstorms, and our day 4 outlook, which is on Saturday, could definitely be the greatest out of what we have looked at so far. This 30% is definitely no joke. The main uncertainties that we do have is only morning time convection and how that may impact the risk for severe thunderstorms. After that moves it out of the area, how the atmosphere may recover behind it. But if it can recover quickly enough, we could definitely see the potential for some very significant severe thunderstorms, and we will be watching this closely. And I don't want to jump the gun on this, but I do think a moderate risk may be possible depending on what models want to say. We are still in our medium range. We have, I think, maybe one high-resolution model out, maybe not even any. So it will depend on what our high-resolution models want to indicate, but this could definitely be a very significant risk for severe thunderstorms by the time this rolls around. So if you do live in the affected area, definitely make sure you are watching for updates on this. For our day 5 outlook, we do have a 15% for a lot of the Midwest and back into the central plains for southern Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, Arkansas, eastern Oklahoma, and northeastern Texas. Taking a look at our WPC outlook and our risk for excessive rainfall for today. We do have a marginal risk for the central plains across Oklahoma into Arkansas, Missouri, southern Kansas, and northern Texas there, where we could see the potential of some isolated flash flooding. This is going to be associated with some of those more widespread rain showers and potentially some severe thunderstorms in that region up to the north of that slight risk region. We could definitely see the potential of maybe some isolated flash flooding, but storm coverage may be a little bit more limited. In fact, I feel like this marginal risk should be a little bit further up to the north if there's going to be a flash flooding risk at all. For tomorrow, we do have a slight risk for the central plains for Kansas, Missouri, northern Arkansas, and Oklahoma. Then for day 3 outlook, we have a dual slight risk region for some of the Mississippi region in the Arklatex area, as well as some regions of the Midwest there. Sorry about that. I wasn't expecting that to happen twice, but for our winter weather outlooks for today, we don't really have all that much of a region that we are watching for the potential of some heavy snowfall. We could see the potential of some isolated heavy snowfall for very elevated portions, very isolated portions of the mountain change that runs through Washington and Oregon there. For tomorrow, we could see the potential of some more widespread but very isolated and very elevated heavy snowfall for a lot of the Rockies. Same for our day 3 outlook, where we could see the potential of some very heavy snowfall for isolated and elevated portions of the Rockies. It may be a little bit more widespread, but it's still going to be elevated and a little bit more isolated. Taking a look at our National Hurricane Center and what we currently have as far as tropical disturbances, something that's very interesting is that we already have a tropical disturbance. It does have a less than 40% chance of developing into a cyclone. However, it does have the potential to be at least a tropical storm, not necessarily tropical storm as in a rotating cyclone, just a step below a hurricane, but just a tropical storm as in just a area of low pressure that could harbor some severe thunderstorms out in the ocean here. This won't really pose all that much of a risk. In fact, it is a very small area of development, and it only does have a 10%, so we will likely not really see this develop into much. Taking a look at our weather models, starting off with our 500 millibars like we usually do, as well as our surface observations and how those are going to work in conjunction with our risk for severe thunderstorms. For today, we do have a pretty broad 500 millibar jet here that is exiting out into the Pacific here, the Atlantic, but it has left a stationary front in its wake, and that should trigger off the potential for maybe one or two supercells that may fire off in that slight risk region. Still uncertain on if they will fire or not. Some models have indicated that they may not even fire at all. I'm looking at you, HRRR, but further up to the north, it's honestly quite hard to tell what our storms are going to be firing off of, because there's not really any surface disturbance, any frontal systems that are going to be triggering our severe thunderstorms. However, if we do look at our temperatures and our dew points, again, there's still no disturbance or frontal system that is really going to be firing off our storm. So this is probably just going to be a little bit more of an upper level disturbance that may translate down to the surface. This may not even be a surface based risk. This is probably still going to be more of an elevated risk, but still interesting to see. Taking a look at our 850 millibars and how that's going to indicate our tornado risk across this region. As of right now, we are expected to see a low-level jet that is expected to strengthen out of the south here. That is going to be pretty strong. It isn't going to be terribly strong, but it is definitely going to be pretty decent, upwards of 30 to 40 miles per hour, which is going to be able to lead to quite a lot of directional shear across this region. Definitely going to support a tornado risk, with it being out of the south here at our lowest levels. In our our 500 millibars being out of the west here, you can already see that what our photographs are going to look like. So that we definitely have a pretty good crossover and quite a lot of directional shear that will indicate the potential for tornadoes across this region. Taking a look at our 200 millibars and how that's going to affect our risk for severe thunderstorms overall, as well as our speed shear for our risk for hail across this region, we are expected to see a 200 millibar jet that is going to slowly strengthen out of the southwest here and turn to the west and potentially even move further to the southwest the further east it goes. But we are expected to see this be pretty strong, upwards of 70 to 80 knots. It's definitely not going to be too terribly strong, but it is definitely going to be in that moderate range and should definitely lead to some fairly decent speed shear. I almost said instability. Fairly decent speed shear to support the risk for hail and potentially some massive hailstones across this region. Same with further up north, we are expected to see a pretty strong 200 millibar jet here up north as well, upwards of 80 knots, which will also lead to some pretty decent shear across this region. As far as our spreading of our wind vectors go, we don't really have that much spreading. It is mostly zonal, so we aren't really expected to see that defluence aloft that will really support an insane amount of lift. Taking a look at our bulk shear and how that's going to indicate a hail risk across the slight risk region, we are expected to see some pretty strong speed shear across this region. It's not going to be too terribly strong. We are expected to see speed shear, bulk shear values upwards of the mid to upper 40 knots, which is definitely going to be in that moderate range and definitely going to be able to support the risk for hail across this region. However, with this being a little bit more moderate speed shear, I do think that we will need to see what our instability looks like before we can really get an idea as for our hail risk, because I think this may be more leaning on our instability side of things and how strong those updrafts are going to be than it is going to be on our shear side of things. Again, we do have a 15% risk for some large hail across this region, so nothing too terribly crazy. So we are bound to see some lower end shear, which is why I do think is going to be leaning on our instability a little bit more. Further up to the north, though, however, we are expected to see quite a lot of speed shear across this region. It's going to be fairly similar to further down south with 40 knots of bulk shear across this region, which is going to be indicative and supportive of the potential of some isolated hail across this region. Taking a look at our directional shear and how that's going to indicate the risk for tornadoes across this region, we are expected to see some pretty strong directional shear across this region, as indicated by our pretty prominent change in direction with height and general visual of what our photographs are probably going to look like, which we will look at later on our observed soundings. But as far as storm relative helicity goes, we are expected to see some pretty strong storm relative helicity values, upwards of 400, which is definitely going to be supportive of a tornado risk across this region. I am using the ARRR models, which I was using our name 3 kilometer models earlier. I didn't really want to use our ARRR, but name 3 kilometer doesn't have our shear models on not pivotal, but radar omega for some reason. But our ARRR is having a hard time firing storms along the stationary front, so that's why I didn't really want to use ARRR. Every other model, I'm pretty sure, except for ARRR, is firing supercellular 2 across the stationary front. ARRR is the only model that doesn't want to for some reason. Taking a look at our composite reflectivity, we are going to go over some general radar analysis as well as our timing for our storms. So let's start off with our radar analysis, because I kind of have a hard time going on with our timing. Sometimes I'll just completely forget to do it. But starting off with our radar analysis, so I don't forget to do our timing, our storms are expected to fire around the slight risk region, around New Mexico, potentially back into western Oklahoma, mainly around western Texas, mainly around the New Mexico Texas border region. We are using name 3 kilometer CONUS, so storms actually do fire, so I can go over timing. We do have the possibility of storms not firing. That is definitely a very big possibility. The cap could definitely be too strong, and storms could definitely work with our ARRR a little bit better and not fire at all. So I am going over our name 3 kilometer CONUS models in the scenario that storms do fire. But our storms are expected to fire potentially 2. I did mention the potential for maybe 1 or 2 supercells firing, and that's going to be about it. They are mainly going to fire around a 7 to 8 to 9 p.m. So subtract an hour off of that, around 6, 7, 8 p.m. across this region, and then move into the slight risk region, likely around 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. Then around midnight, we should see our storms move into the La Mesa area. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. And then our storms are going to quickly die off as the sun sets. We lose our surface heating and the convective inhibition is reintroduced. Further up to the north, though, we are expected to see some pretty widespread convection. This is our name 3 kilometer CONUS model, so we're going to see rain showers absolutely everywhere, because that's what it does for some reason. But we are expected to see a cluster of rain showers with some embedded severe thunderstorms being possible across the slight risk region. The ARRR was indicating maybe some more isolated development back into Oklahoma. But we should see our storms mainly develop around midnight towards western Oklahoma and move into the marginal risk area around the Oklahoma-Kansas border. We should see storms likely extend all the way up into central Kansas there, but we are likely going to see our storms likely move into this region probably in the very, very early morning of tomorrow and into the hours of the morning commute. Taking a look at our dew points and how that's going to affect our instability, we are continuing to see warm air advection out of the south, and we may be able to see a little bit of a dry line setup. However, we will not have forcing out of the west to really make it a true dry line setup. So we are likely going to see our storms fire off of our stationary front. If anything, this dry line is just not going to have enough forcing to really support much development off of it. But it is forming a triple point with that stationary front, and we could likely see storms fire around there along our stationary front. But we will see some pretty decent moisture with dew points upwards of the mid to upper 60s, which is definitely going to be fairly supportive and indicative of quite a lot of instability across this region, and whatever moisture is lost will likely be immediately resupplied with constant warm air advection out of the south. For our dew points further up to the north, we are probably going to see some fairly decent moisture across this region. It is not nearly going to be as strong. It could go from decent to very low end, with dew points are probably going to be ranging anywhere from the mid to upper 60s to the low and mid 50s, which is going to lead to a very, very large gradient of instability across this region. And our instability may not even be able to extend that far north along this boundary of 60s dew points up to the north. So we may not see a whole lot of surface instability up to the north in that main region, which is going to lead to that low end tornado risk, to the potential of no tornadoes whatsoever. Again, we don't have a tornado risk for this region, but we could see some more lower end instability, but our instability will likely be better further down to the south. Taking a look at our temperatures across this region, how that's going to affect our instability. Before the sun sets, we are expected to see temperatures that could reach the low 90s and upper to mid 80s, which is definitely going to be pretty hot and support some fairly large daytime heating, and that's going to lead to our cap being eroded pretty quickly and aid with our storm development later on. But our cap is going to be really strong, which we will look at later, so that will delay our storm development to when the sun actually sets. When our storms actually do develop, they will likely form an environment that has temperatures upwards of the mid to low 70s and the upper 60s, which is still fairly warm and could definitely support some decent instability, but our surface instability may potentially be a little bit more limited as the sun continues to set and convective inhibition at the surface is reintroduced. Again, that will definitely be a really big uncertainty with the risk for severe thunderstorms today, is the convective inhibition. Taking a look at our temperatures and how that's going to affect our instability up to the north, we are definitely going to see some more limited temperatures, especially with the warm front being further down to the south, attached to that stationary front. I'm surprised that the surface observations didn't analyze a warm front here. There probably wasn't enough forcing, but I'm honestly surprised they didn't even analyze a stationary front there. But we do see some pretty lower end temperatures upwards of the low 60s to mid 60s, which will definitely lead to some lower end instability across this region, especially with our main storm risk being very late in the afternoon and very early morning, way past the sun setting. That is definitely going to lead to probably no surface instability whatsoever, and a lack of a whole lot of fuel to really support anything too severe. Taking a look at our lapse rates and how that's going to affect our instability and our risk for hail across the slight risk region first, we are expected to see some pretty decent lapse rates across this region, with lapse rates that could potentially get upwards of the upper 70s to maybe a isolated low 8 across this region, which is definitely going to aid in instability across this region. Will definitely be needed to support surface-based storms, especially with how much surface instability or surface convective inhibition and potentially more limited surface instability due to the sun already being set. So we will definitely need our lapse rates to really aid with that. And then further up to the north here, let's switch our view up to the central plain so we can see our lapse rates. Further up to the north, we will definitely see much more limited lapse rates, but they are going to be more than 5, and we are expected to see lapse rates that could get upwards of 6 to potentially 7 further down to the south, which will definitely aid in our instability, but won't really aid a whole lot. But if we want decent instability amongst our more moderate temperatures and dew points, we will definitely need this. Switching back down to the south here so we can look at how that will affect our hail risk. Again, our instability, our strong lapse rates will definitely be pretty aiding in our hail risk, as it will expand our layer for hail development and allow for the potential of some massive hailstones across this region. Same with further up to the north, where we do have a lower end hail risk, and our lower end lapse rates definitely match that as well. Taking a look at our 700 millibar temperatures as well as our convective inhibition and how that's going to affect our instability and our overall risk for severe thunderstorms across this region. Starting off with our slight risk region further down to the south, as I was previously mentioning, we are going to see our storms development in a region where the sun is still up, but it will be setting by the time our storms develop. So with constant warm air advection out of the south at 700 millibars, the second the sun sets, we are expected to see rapid reintroduction of our cap. And that will really choke out our storms after they form and after they move into the slight risk region, which is why the slight risk region isn't too terribly big, because we have our convective inhibition that's immediately going to cut off any further storm development and will slowly choke it out from there. So that is definitely giving it a very short window for storm development, and our storm timing is definitely going to be a huge playing factor along with our convective inhibition. And then our convective inhibition is also indicating a pretty nice stationary front there, as I was indicating earlier. I'm not sure why we didn't get a stationary front analyzed there on our surface observations, because our convective inhibition does clearly indicate one. So we may be able to see some additional development further down to the south for that, further down to the south in that marginal third area across northern Oklahoma. But we won't nearly be as affected by convective inhibition, so that may not really limit our storm development too much, but it also won't allow for our instability to really build that much as it will further down to the south, especially with that convective inhibition that needs to be broken before our storms are going to develop. Taking a look at our most unstable cape and how that's going to indicate our risk for severe thunderstorms across this region, we are expected to see quite a lot of most unstable cape across this region. We will look at our surface-based cape for our tornado risk later, but for our most unstable cape overall, we are expected to see some very large amounts of instability across this region. They aren't going to be too terribly large, but they could definitely reach upwards of 3,000 in some isolated regions, which is definitely approaching some higher-end territory of instability. So that will definitely allow for explosive updrafts, especially with that convective inhibition that needs to be broken. By the time our convective inhibition breaks, that could definitely lead to some pretty explosive updrafts across this region, and this will definitely be able to fuel the risk for hail and the potential for some massive hailstones across this region. As for our marginal threat further up to the north here, we are expected to see some lower end instability as what was previously expected, with cape values are probably going to be ranging upwards of the triple digits, maybe reaching the 1000s in some regions. I doubt we're going to see too widespread instability values upwards of the 1000s, may not reach the 2000s. Our NAM 3 kilometer definitely does like to exaggerate some pockets here, so we aren't going to see a whole lot of 0 to 3 kilometer, instability at our most unstable. Upwards of 2,000 across this region is probably definitely going to be more limited to a low 1,000 and widespread triple digits. Taking a look at our surface-based cape and how that's going to indicate the risk for tornadoes across this region and surface-based storms, we are expected to see a surface-based cape. The majority of our most unstable cape is expected to translate down to our surface, and that will allow for surface-based storms with the potential for tornadoes across this region. So there's not really much to be said, and it does look like we are expected to see surface instability that is going to continue to be in place as storms continue to die across the slight risk region. However, with our convective inhibition that is going to choke out our storms, so our surface-based cape and our most unstable cape, despite it being strong, will not be able to fuel an updraft if our convective inhibition is put back into place. And then as far as our marginal risk further up to the north, we are probably not going to see that much surface-based instability whatsoever, so our storms are going to be elevated and will not be able to support a tornado risk. Taking a look at our 0 to 3 kilometer instability, I don't really have a whole lot to say about this, except the fact that both regions are not really going to see a whole lot of 0 to 3 kilometer instability, so we will not see that massive aid at the surface there from our 0 to 3 kilometers, due to that 0 to 3 kilometer instability basically being nothing. Taking a look at our energy helicity index values across this region, we definitely have some pretty large energy helicity index values for our 2% tornado risk area. And that does indicate the potential of a higher end tornado risk. However, with our convective inhibition just being so strong and having such a short window for tornadic development, and our NAM 3 km tending to exaggerate some things, so these energy helicity index values will likely be much lower in reality. But with our 0 to 3 kilometer, sorry, not our 0 to 3 kilometer, but our convective inhibition being so strong and having such a short window for tornadic development as a result of that, we are expected to see much more lower end tornado risk than what is being indicated by our NAM 3 km. Taking a look at our 10-meter wind gusts and how that's going to indicate the potential for damaging wind gusts across this region. I did have to use pivotal weather for this because NAM 3 km doesn't have our wind gust models on Radar Omega for some reason, but it is on pivotal. But again, as I was previously mentioning in the intro here, we could definitely see wind gusts upwards of 70 miles per hour as highlighted by the SPC. Models don't get that high. And I can't really verify what the SPC says about the risk for damaging wind gusts, because in all honesty, I'm still learning how to forecast damaging wind gusts, and that's honestly one of the bigger things I probably need to learn. If anyone knows any good guides to learning how to forecast damaging wind gusts, because I've tried to find some, I just couldn't find any. If you have a link to a video that's pretty good for forecasting damaging wind gusts, please put it in the description. I will give credit to you in the next video if you do. However, I can't really verify what the SPC says about the damaging wind gust risk, because in all honesty, I don't really know too good how to forecast that, so I have to go over our wind gust models. But for our damaging wind gust models, it is indicating upwards of 50 miles per hour at least, 55 miles per hour, so we could definitely see some pretty strong damaging wind gusts across this region. It could definitely get upwards to 70 miles per hour as the SPC was indicating, but models are indicating a bare minimum of 50 miles per hour. Taking a look at our meso-analysis page for our hail risk, for our slight risk region where we are seeing the potential for some massive hailstones, we have some very, very strong large hail parameter values across this region, with multiple separate areas that indicate 24 in like 4 separate regions across western Texas here in central Texas, and a region that does indicate 32 on our large hail parameter. Across the slight risk region, we could see large hail parameter values anywhere from 20 to 24, which is definitely pretty indicative of the potential for large hail across this region. But with the uncertainties of if storms can even fire or not, as well as overall lower end bulk shear across this region, in reality, I do think that these large hail parameter values should definitely be a little bit more lower, especially with that conditional risk and more limited directional shear aloft. But we could definitely see the potential for some massive hailstones across this region. So it does still indicate the potential for large hail and potentially some massive hailstones, but I definitely don't think it's going to be this extent. Taking a look at our large hail parameter for the hail risk further up to the north, with that stationary front being across Oklahoma here, we currently don't have anything indicating a large hail risk across the Central Plains region. This will likely change as models change over time and we get closer to when storms actually develop, because we are still hours out from this risk actually developing. So we will likely see this change. We're probably too early to really have the hail risk be indicated on here, but with that boundary being further up to the further down to the south, I don't really see it changing too much, because it is mainly focusing on the warm sector between our two boundaries. Now that I've told you the weather, please go down to the description and check out the socials for Project Gladiator and join the Discord for any updates on Project Gladiator. If you live in any of the areas I covered for today, please stay with the alert for the time being. If you notice anything might have been wrong in this forecast, or would like to make a suggestion or ask a question, please leave a comment. 3 other channels I highly suggest you check out are One Nation Weather, Weather Watcher, and JaxonWX. The links to those channels will be in the description. And hopefully I'll be able to see you guys tomorrow with another forecast.